What happens when a police officer's word is no longer enough? What if the truth is caught on camera, contradicting everything she claimed? Olivia Harris thought she was doing the right thing, but when the evidence surfaced, it shattered her career. Meanwhile, Khalil Thompson, exonerated and driven by justice, leads the charge for reform. Will Olivia find redemption, or will the system swallow her whole? Find out in this explosive story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to H2 Black Thread. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The polished wood of the pews gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and every single person in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the moment the trial would unfold. The case had become one of the most talked about in Chicago. People were lined up outside the courthouse days in advance just to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. There was no shortage of media coverage, and the streets outside were filled with protests on both sides of the issue. The crowd was divided. Some stood with the police, others with Khalil. In the center of it all was Olivia Harris, a seasoned police officer with 12 years under her belt. She was the key witness for the prosecution, tasked with painting a picture of Khalil Thompson, a black activist accused of assaulting a police officer during a protest. The stakes were high, and everyone in the room understood that. But Olivia, despite her years of experience on the force, couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just another case. This trial, these accusations, had become something more. Olivia sat on the witness stand, straightening her posture. She was dressed in her standard police uniform, looking every bit the part of a dedicated officer. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, her face stoic, and her eyes sharp as she scanned the room. She had seen things in her career that no one should have to see, had dealt with the pressure, the scrutiny, and the danger that came with the badge. But today felt different. Today, her testimony was going to decide the fate of Khalil Thompson, the black activist who was no stranger to controversy, no stranger to the protests that had taken the city by storm. On the opposite side of the courtroom, Khalil sat silently. His posture was relaxed, almost too relaxed, as if he weren't in the middle of a battle that could change the course of his life. His lawyer, Marcus Wilson, was beside him, occasionally whispering something to him as they prepared for the upcoming cross-examination. Khalil's expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning the room, occasionally making eye contact with Olivia. There was a sense of tension between them, a silent recognition of what was at stake, though neither spoke a word. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence, the prosecutor, Michael Langford, stood up from his seat and walked toward Olivia with a calm but deliberate air. He was a man who had spent years honing his craft in the courtroom. He knew how to present a case, how to twist the narrative, how to make the jury see things his way. Today, he had no intention of losing. "Detective Harris," Langford began, his voice clear and firm, "can you confirm for the court that you personally witnessed Mr. Thompson initiate physical contact with Officer Tyler Gray on the night of July 18th? Olivia took a moment, her eyes flicking briefly to Khalil before she turned her attention back to Langford. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her, waiting for her response. There was no room for hesitation, no room for doubt. This was the moment where everything would hinge. She opened her mouth, and her voice, steady and unwavering, filled the room. "Yes," she said, her words punctuated by the authority of someone who had seen countless arrests, countless confrontations, and countless moments of violence. "I saw him throw the first punch." The words hung in the air like a gavel strike, final and undeniable. There was no second-guessing it. She spoke with absolute certainty. Khalil's lawyer, Marcus Wilson, sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He had expected this. Olivia was the prosecution's star witness, after all. She had given her statement to the police, and now she was standing by it in court. But Marcus wasn't worried. He knew what he had up his sleeve. He just needed to wait for his turn. Langford nodded approvingly, a small but confident smile on his lips. He was pleased with Olivia's response. She was doing exactly what they had rehearsed. He pushed further, wanting to cement her testimony in the minds of the jury. "To be clear, Detective Harris," Langford continued, his voice smooth, "you're stating under oath that you saw Mr. Thompson act aggressively first." Again, Olivia didn't hesitate. She didn't falter. She had her story and she was sticking to it. "Yes," she affirmed, her voice carrying a sharp edge. He turned toward Officer Gray, raised his fist, and struck him in the jaw. That's when Officer Gray and I stepped in to subdue him. There it was. Her testimony was airtight, or so she thought. The prosecutor, satisfied with her answers, stepped back, nodding to the judge. The gavel tapped once and the room fell silent once more. The judge, a stern figure behind his desk, turned his attention to the defense. "Mr. Wilson, you may proceed with your questioning." Marcus Wilson stood slowly, buttoning his navy blue suit jacket with an air of practiced ease. He was older, with salt and pepper hair and a sharp gaze. He was the type of lawyer who had seen it all, the kind who knew how to turn a case on its head with the right question at the right time. He didn't look nervous, didn't appear anxious. He simply stepped forward, ready to make his move. "Detective Harris," he began, his tone casual but laced with a subtle edge. "How long have you been with the department?" 12 years, Olivia responded, her voice even. "And in that time you've testified in court before, correct?" Marcus asked, his eyes never leaving hers. "Many times," Olivia answered confidently. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, allowing the weight of the silence to settle. He wanted the jury to pay attention, to understand the gravity of what was coming. He paused for a moment, then exhaled as if he had something truly important to reveal. "That's good to hear," he said, his voice almost sympathetic, though his eyes twinkled with a knowing gleam. "Because what I'm about to show you will require absolute accuracy." Marcus turned toward the defense table where an assistant was already setting up a screen. There was a quiet click of buttons, and the lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly. A moment of suspense filled the room as everyone waited for what was coming next. The video footage from the night of the protest began to play. Olivia's stomach tightened as she watched the shaky, grainy footage from the protest. She could see the flashing red and blue lights, the chaos of bodies moving in every direction. The shouts of protesters blended with the commands of officers, creating a whirlwind of confusion. Olivia squinted, her mind racing as the timestamp on the screen read July 18th, 1042 p.m. The same night she claimed to have seen Khalil throw the first punch. Then the camera steadied, focusing on a scene Olivia knew all too well. Khalil Thompson stood amidst a crowd of officers, his hands raised in an open palm gesture, not aggressive at all. His body language was calm and his words were quick but measured, not the actions of a man about to attack. The footage made it clear. He was not lunging, not raising his fists in aggression. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She watched as Officer Tyler Gray approached Khalil, pushing into his space. Khalil stepped back, his hands still raised in defense. But Tyler, undeterred, shoved him again. The footage was unmistakable. Khalil never threw a punch. Tyler was the one escalating the situation. As the video continued to play, Olivia's mind raced. The room was completely still. The only sound was the soft murmur of the footage, followed by the crack of a baton hitting the pavement. The video ended abruptly and the screen went black. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. The weight of the moment hit like a tidal wave. Olivia's hands clenched around the edge of the witness stand. The truth was out. She had just been exposed. The room was eerily quiet, a palpable tension hanging in the air as the lights dimmed. The audience sat in anxious anticipation. their eyes fixed on the screen that had just flickered to life. Everyone knew this moment would change the course of the trial. The fate of Khalil Thompson and Olivia Harris was about to be sealed, at least for now. Marcus Wilson, Khalil's lawyer, stood with his arms crossed, watching with quiet confidence as the video footage from the protest played out on the screen. Olivia felt a tightness in her chest as the images flashed before her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Marcus to have something like this. She wasn't prepared for it. She had believed her testimony was solid, that there was no question in the case, no doubt that Khalil had thrown the first punch. But now, as she stared at the video, she felt the undeniable weight of the truth creeping in. The camera zoomed in on the chaotic scene from the night of July 18th. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the crowd of protesters, their voices rising in shouts. The footage was shaky at first, making it hard to distinguish who was who, but as the scene steadied, Khalil Thompson came into clear view. There he was, standing near a group of officers. His hands were raised in the universal gesture of defense, palms open, as if signaling he didn't want trouble. His face wasn't contorted in anger, but rather calm, his lips moving quickly in conversation. Then the camera shifted slightly, and Olivia could see the officer Tyler Gray, the one she had testified against Khalil for allegedly attacking. The officer was in Khalil's space, pushing him aggressively, his hands reaching toward Khalil's chest, jabbing a finger at him. Khalil took a half step back, still trying to maintain his calm, still trying to create space. But Tyler didn't stop. The officer closed the gap between them, shoving Khalil forcefully, enough to make Khalil stumble back and almost lose his balance. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She watched as Tyler shoved Khalil again, and again. Khalil's body jerked as he struggled to steady himself on the curb, his hand moving toward his collar to prevent himself from falling. Olivia had seen this play out countless times, but never with her eyes wide open, never from this angle, never from the perspective of a camera that didn't lie. The footage didn't show Khalil throwing a punch. It didn't show any aggression on his part. Instead, it showed Tyler Gray advancing toward Khalil, pushing him, making the situation escalate. The defensive stance Khalil had been holding was the only thing keeping him from being pushed further into the crowd. Olivia could feel the heat rising in her chest. The truth was undeniable. Khalil had been the victim in this confrontation, not the aggressor. The video was clear, clearer than any testimony, clearer than any memory she had clung to about that night. And yet, it was too late. The damage was already done. The crowd in the courtroom shifted restlessly as the footage continued to play. A few people gasped in shock. A few reporters were scribbling frantically, their pens moving faster than they could process the scene unfolding before them. Olivia's hands clenched, and she could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. This wasn't supposed to happen, she thought. I had it all figured out. The video came to an abrupt end, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. No one dared speak, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The weight of the truth was so heavy that it almost felt suffocating. Olivia glanced around the room, her eyes flicking to the jury. Their faces were unreadable, but she could see the doubt beginning to cloud their expressions. The weight of the evidence had begun to shift in Khalil's favor. Olivia didn't need to look to know what was happening. She could feel it, the shift, the doubt, the realization from the courtroom that Khalil had been right all along. The prosecution's star witness had just been exposed as unreliable. Marcus Wilson didn't waste any time. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Detective Harris," he said, his tone calm, measured, but there was something sharper beneath the surface. As we just saw in the video, Mr. Thompson never raised his fists in aggression. He was simply standing there, trying to keep his balance, trying to avoid a confrontation, wasn't he? Olivia swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on her, their gaze sharp, accusatory. The weight of the truth was heavier than the air in the room, and she couldn't breathe. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She knew she had to answer, but what could she say? What could she say when the video had completely contradicted everything she had said on the witness stand? How could she explain away the truth, the undeniable truth that was staring her in the face? Detective Harris. Marcus's voice was gentle now, but it carried the sharp sting of a man who knew he had her cornered. The footage shows that Mr. Thompson was the one being assaulted, not the one doing the assaulting. How do you explain that? Olivia's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand, knuckles turning white as she searched for an explanation. I was wrong, she thought, her mind racing, but I can't say that. Not here. Not now. She cleared her throat, trying to compose herself. I don't know, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard. I thought I saw him attack Officer Gray, but the video shows something different. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as those words escaped her lips. There it was. She had admitted it. She had been wrong. And now the truth was there for everyone to see. The judge's gavel rang out, cutting through the silence. Order, he barked, trying to maintain control over the growing chaos. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The truth had been revealed, and the courtroom would never be the same again. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, the blood rushing to her ears. She felt like she was suffocating, like the weight of her own lies was pulling her down into a dark abyss. Detective Harris, Marcus Wilson said, his voice softer now, almost too calm. You testified under oath that you saw Khalil Thompson initiate the physical confrontation with Officer Gray, but we all saw with our own eyes that the video shows otherwise. How do you explain that? The pressure was unbearable now. Olivia could feel her pulse in her fingertips, her mind spinning but her body frozen in place. The truth was out and there was no going back. There was no defense, no justification. She was exposed. Answer the question, detective, Marcus pressed, his voice steady as he watched her crumble under the weight of her own testimony. Olivia wanted to run. She wanted to hide, but she couldn't. She was here and the courtroom was waiting for her to face what she had done. I was wrong, she said finally, the words escaping her lips as if they were forced out like the truth had a power of its own. I couldn't see it clearly that night. The video. It shows the truth. I was wrong. A murmur rippled through the room, some gasping, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The truth had come out. Olivia had lied. And now the trial would never be the same. The air in the courtroom felt heavier now, thicker with the weight of uncertainty. Olivia Harris stood there, frozen in place, as the reality of what had just happened hit her like a ton of bricks. The video had exposed her for what she was, a woman who had failed to see the truth, or worse, had chosen to ignore it. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her palms felt slick with sweat. It was as if the walls of the courtroom were closing in on her. Her usual poise, the confidence she had built over 12 years as a police officer, had evaporated into thin air. She was no longer that confident officer, the one who always had the answers, the one who was in control. Now, she was just a woman standing before a room full of people who had witnessed her unravel, piece by piece. The questions came fast, relentless. Marcus Wilson, Khalil Thompson's lawyer, hadn't even finished his last sentence when he fired the next one at her, almost as though he was toying with her, making her confront the undeniable truth in front of everyone. Detective Harris, he began, his voice calm but tinged with the sharpness of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. You testified earlier that you witnessed Khalil Thompson physically attack Officer Gray. But now, as we've all seen in the video, that's not the case, is it? Olivia tried to swallow, but her throat was dry. Her mouth felt like cotton and her chest tightened with anxiety. She had expected the cross-examination to be hard, but she never imagined it would be like this. The video had turned everything upside down, shattered her certainty, and forced her to face her own failure. She had stood before this court, sworn to tell the truth, and yet the truth had been distorted in her own mind. I was wrong," Olivia said, her voice trembling as she spoke. The words didn't feel real. They felt foreign, like they didn't belong to her. "I didn't see everything clearly that night." The courtroom was dead silent. Every single person was watching her now. They had all seen the truth, and now Olivia was forced to admit she had lied, not just to the court but to herself. The tension in the room seemed to stretch on forever as the implications of her admission hit her. She felt exposed, vulnerable. There was no escaping the fact that the video had completely disproven her testimony. Her credibility was in ruins. The weight of it was suffocating, and as her gaze shifted around the courtroom, she saw the judgment in the eyes of the jury, the prosecutor, and the spectators. They were all waiting for her to crumble. But it was the crowd's reaction that hit hardest. Before Olivia could gather herself to say anything more, a voice from the back of the courtroom pierced through the silence. "Liar!" someone shouted, their voice filled with anger and disgust. The word rang out like a slap to the face, cutting through the heavy air like a knife. Olivia's head snapped up and her eyes widened in shock. "Liar!" And then, like a wave crashing over her, the courtroom erupted. Whispers, gasps, and shouts filled the room as the word bounced off the walls. It wasn't just one person anymore. A murmur started at the back of the room, growing louder and more intense. Olivia could hear the sharpness in the voices around her, the judgment and disdain that now surrounded her like an inescapable storm. "Liar!" a woman yelled from the left side of the room, and the chorus followed. The whispers spread through the crowd, each voice condemning her, questioning her integrity. Olivia could feel her face flush with humiliation. She didn't know where to look, didn't know how to hold herself in the face of such vitriol. Her chest tightened, and her stomach churned. She had stood on the witness stand with such certainty, with such unwavering confidence that she was doing the right thing. Now, those same people who had trusted her were calling her a liar. Her mind raced, but there was no escape. She wanted to shrink, to hide, to somehow disappear from the harsh spotlight of the courtroom. The spotlight that once felt like it validated her, now burned with a scalding heat that made her feel small and insignificant. The judge's gavel struck sharply, cutting through the chaos. "Order in the court," the judge shouted, his voice firm and authoritative. "I will have order." The noise subsided, but the damage had been done. The court was back in order, but the whispers and murmurs from the crowd continued to reverberate in Olivia's ears, even though they were now hushed. She could feel the eyes on her, each one accusing her, tearing at her with silent judgment. Marcus Wilson took a step forward, his gaze fixed firmly on Olivia. His next words were slow, deliberate, almost calculated. "Detective Harris," he said, his voice now dripping with sarcasm, "are you telling this court that your testimony was inaccurate? That what you swore to under oath was nothing more than a mistake?" Olivia opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say? What could she possibly say to explain the discrepancies? There was no defense for it. The video had exposed her failure. Her credibility was gone, her integrity shattered, and she had no way of putting it back together. I thought I saw what I saw," Olivia managed to say, but the words felt hollow. They were empty, and she knew it. She wasn't even sure she believed them anymore. Her shoulders slumped slightly as the weight of her actions settled in. The voices in her head were getting louder, drowning out the proceedings of the trial. She thought about the years she had spent on the force, the pride she had taken in her work. She thought about how she had always believed in doing what was right, following the law, upholding justice. And now all of that was in question. She could feel the sting of betrayal, both from herself and from the people around her. Her colleagues, the ones who had stood by her all these years, were no longer looking at her with the same trust. She could feel their eyes on her, no longer filled with admiration but with doubt and disbelief. Some of them looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze, while others simply stared, their expressions hard and unyielding. And then there was the public, the people she had once fought for, the people who had believed in her. They were no longer on her side. Olivia knew that her career was on the line. The police department, the very system she had dedicated her life to, was now beginning to turn its back on her. She could sense it, the subtle shift, the way people were beginning to distance themselves from her. The whispers, the looks, she could feel them all. She could almost hear the conversations that would take place later behind closed doors about whether she was still fit to serve. Her pulse quickened, and for a brief moment she felt dizzy. The world around her seemed to spin as the reality of what she had done sank deeper into her chest. The public had already made up its mind, and her colleagues, the people she once thought of as friends and allies, they too were starting to turn away. Olivia felt her isolation settling in. She was no longer part of the team. She was no longer the officer they trusted. She was alone in a sea of accusations with nowhere to turn. "Detective Harris," the judge's voice rang out, jolting her back to the present. "Answer the question." But Olivia didn't have an answer. There was no way to undo what she had done, no way to change the truth. All she could do now was stand there, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders, knowing that her career, her reputation, and everything she had worked for were slipping through her fingers, piece by piece. Olivia Harris had been a cop for 12 years, and in all that time, she had never faced anything like this. In the blink of an eye, her entire career, everything she had worked for was crumbling. It wasn't just the loss of her reputation that hurt. It was the realization that she had betrayed something much bigger than herself, the very ideals she had sworn to uphold. The investigation came quickly, a formal process that felt more like a public execution than anything else. Olivia was placed on administrative leave almost immediately after the courtroom chaos. The department couldn't afford the scandal, not after everything had unfolded in front of the world. Her actions, her lies, had put a dark stain on the police force, and there was no way to hide from it. She had been a model officer, reliable, sharp, and always professional, but none of that mattered now. The truth had caught up with her, and the consequences were harsh, swift, and unavoidable. Internal Affairs launched a full investigation into her conduct, and the charges were serious. She was being investigated for perjury, the very crime she had spent her career fighting against in others. It was almost poetic in its irony, but that did little to console her. Days felt like weeks as she sat in her apartment, the silence pressing down on her. Olivia couldn't shake the thought that she had destroyed her life and the lives of those who had trusted her. Her phone buzzed constantly, calls from her colleagues, reporters, and even some family members, each message a reminder of the fallout. Every conversation started the same. "What happened, Olivia? How could you?" Her colleagues in the department, the ones who had once supported her, now saw her through a different lens. Some of them refused to look her in the eye when she passed by in the hallway. Others whispered behind her back, their words carrying on the air like knives. Olivia had always prided herself on her ability to hold the line, but now she was being held to the fire. Her superiors were no better. Captain Mitchell, who had once been a mentor to her, was visibly distant when they spoke. He hadn't outright accused her yet, but the disappointment in his eyes was enough. "Olivia, you're not just jeopardizing your career," he had told her in a tense meeting. "You're putting the entire department at risk. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about trust. It's about integrity." She had nothing to say. How could she defend herself when the truth was that she had failed in every possible way? Meanwhile, on the other side of the courtroom, Khalil Thompson was making a name for himself in a way that Olivia couldn't even fathom. Khalil had been exonerated, the charges dropped, his name cleared. But he wasn't just satisfied with that. He wasn't content to let the system off the hook just because one trial had ended in his favor. He knew that the truth was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, one that involved more than just clearing his name. Khalil became the face of something much larger. With his lawyer, Marcus Wilson, by his side, he began speaking out about the systemic issues within the police force and the judicial system. He was no longer just a man fighting for his own freedom. He had become a symbol of reform, an advocate for change, and someone whose voice rang louder than ever before. Khalil's speeches and interviews were everywhere. His words resonated with people across the nation, particularly within communities that had been victimized by similar systems. People saw him not just as a man wronged, but as a leader, as someone who had the courage to take a stand, to fight against the system that had tried to destroy him. He was a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless, and he quickly became a public figure. Justice isn't about winning a case, it's about demanding change, Khalil said in one of his many speeches. What we've seen in this courtroom is just the tip of the iceberg. For too long, the system has been set up to protect its own, no matter what, but we can change that. We will change that. He spoke with conviction, his words like fire, sparking passion in the hearts of thousands. Khalil didn't just want to move on with his life. He wanted to tear down the walls that had kept people like him, people from communities like his, oppressed for generations. He called for an overhaul of the system, accountability for the police officers who misused their power, transparency in every aspect of law enforcement, and a fundamental shift in how the justice system operated. As Khalil's voice grew louder, so did the movement. Protests erupted, not only in Chicago but across the country. The people who had supported Khalil during his trial were now joining him in a fight for justice on a much larger scale. They marched through the streets, chanting his name, demanding that the corrupt practices within the police force be brought to an end. The media coverage was relentless. News outlets covered every speech, every march, every interview Khalil gave. His message was clear: the system was broken, and it needed to be fixed. People listened, and they acted. His words ignited something in the public, something that could no longer be ignored. But in all of this, Olivia remained a ghost in her own life. The very people who had once praised her for her integrity and her courage now turned their backs on her. She could no longer look herself in the mirror. She had betrayed everything she had ever stood for, and the consequences were too great for her to bear. The contrast between Khalil's rise and Olivia's fall couldn't have been more stark. Where Khalil was becoming a symbol of hope, of resilience, Olivia was becoming a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when someone in power lost sight of the truth. But despite her personal failure, Olivia couldn't help but admire the strength Khalil had shown. He hadn't been broken. He hadn't allowed the system to crush his spirit. Instead, he had used his pain to fuel a movement that would change everything. As Olivia sat in the silence of her apartment, scrolling through social media and reading about Khalil's progress, she couldn't help but wonder if she could ever be part of such a change. She had ruined her career, yes, but the world was shifting. The conversation around justice was evolving. Could she, in some small way, contribute to that? Could she redeem herself in a world that had begun to demand more from its leaders? The truth was, Olivia didn't know. But what she did know was this: the battle wasn't over. Khalil had already proved that much, and maybe, just maybe, there was still a way for her to make things right. Olivia Harris sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, her gaze fixed on the walls that had once felt like a sanctuary. It had been a few weeks since the trial, but it felt like a lifetime. The silence in her home was suffocating. She hadn't spoken to anyone from the department in days. The phone calls had stopped, the messages had dried up. Her colleagues, they distanced themselves. The reporters, they had moved on to the next big story. But Olivia, she was left alone to confront the aftermath of her mistakes. For the first time in 12 years, she felt like a complete outsider in her own life. The badge she had worn with pride, the uniform that had once represented everything she stood for, now felt like an iron shackle around her wrists. She couldn't escape the memories of the courtroom, of the moment she admitted she was wrong. The sound of the word liar still echoed in her ears. The faces of her fellow officers, her friends, burned into her mind. She had betrayed their trust, and now she was paying the price. She hadn't expected it to be easy. She had known there would be consequences, but she hadn't imagined the emotional toll it would take. It wasn't just the loss of her career or the public shaming. It was the deep, gnawing regret that had settled in her heart. It was the realization that she had let her own personal bias, her own stubbornness, lead her to make a choice that had devastated so many lives. Not just Khalil's, but the trust of every person who had ever believed in her. She had been one of them, the system, and now she had become a symbol of what was wrong with it. The weight of it all threatened to suffocate her. Olivia had always prided herself on her ability to uphold justice. She had always believed that she was doing the right thing, following the rules, making decisions based on what was best for the greater good. But now, standing in the ruins of her own life, she realized that the very system she had worked to protect had failed her, and that she had failed it. Yet, as the days passed, something began to shift. It started with a simple thought, a flicker of an idea that seemed impossible at first: change. She had spent so much time running from her mistake, trying to avoid the fallout, trying to protect what was left of her dignity. But what if, instead of running, she embraced the pain, the consequences, and allowed herself the chance to learn from it? What if, instead of drowning in self-pity and shame, she took the first steps toward redemption? Olivia knew that it wasn't going to be easy. Redemption wasn't something that could be earned overnight. It would take time, humility, and a lot of hard work. But for the first time since the trial, Olivia allowed herself to believe that change was possible. She began by reaching out. Slowly, tentatively, she called her old friends in the department. Some of them answered, though their voices were strained, and others refused to pick up at all. But with every call, with every message sent, she felt the weight of her mistakes begin to shift. She wasn't expecting forgiveness, not yet. But she knew she had to make an effort, not just for herself, but for the people she had failed. As part of the internal investigation, Olivia began attending sessions with a counselor assigned by the department. It wasn't easy. She had never been one to open up about her emotions, about her doubts, about her fears. But there, in that sterile office, she started to peel back the layers of the person she had become. She realized that her entire career had been driven by the need to prove something to others, to prove that she could be the best, that she could do everything right. But in doing so, she had lost sight of what really mattered, the truth. And now, as she faced the consequences of her actions, she was finally forced to reckon with that truth. But in the midst of her own healing, there was still the matter of Khalil. Despite everything that had happened, despite the pain he had endured, Khalil was not defeated. In fact, he was more determined than ever. His name had been cleared, yes. But Khalil understood that justice wasn't just about winning a single case. It was about dismantling a system that had failed so many. It was about creating real, lasting change. And that was exactly what he set out to do. Khalil's voice had become one of the most powerful in the fight for police reform. He continued to speak at rallies, lead protests, and hold the system accountable for the corruption that ran deep within it. The media followed him wherever he went, eager to capture his words, his vision for a better future. Justice isn't just about being exonerated, Khalil said in one of his speeches. It's about accountability. It's about recognizing the flaws within a system that perpetuates injustice and working tirelessly to fix it. We are not done here. We will not rest until the system works for everyone, not just a select few. His words were powerful, and they struck a chord with millions of people across the country. Khalil's message was clear. The fight for justice was ongoing, and it was not limited to one person's exoneration. It was about a movement. It was about accountability, transparency, and the fundamental changes needed in the police force. It was about creating a society where every person, no matter their race, background, or socio-economic status, could feel safe and valued. Khalil's work wasn't just about himself anymore. He had become the face of something larger than any one individual. He had become the voice for those who had been oppressed, for those who had been silenced, for those who had been wronged by a system designed to protect only the powerful. And through it all, Olivia couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. In the midst of her own despair, she saw Khalil's rise, his refusal to let the system break him, and she knew that she had witnessed something extraordinary. His journey wasn't over, and neither was hers, but there was a difference between the two of them. Khalil had embraced the truth from the very beginning, and that truth had given him the strength to move forward. Olivia realized that, like Khalil, she could start again. She could embrace the truth and use it to rebuild herself. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. She wasn't just working for forgiveness. She was working for change within herself, within the system, and within the world around her. The last few months had shown Olivia just how fragile everything she had known truly was. But they had also shown her something else, the power of redemption. Khalil had proven that change was possible, and now it was her turn to prove the same to herself. Olivia took a deep breath, looking out of her apartment window at the busy city street below. She wasn't sure where the road would take her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back.